Welcome, everyone. I am Allison O'Toole, the CEO of Second Harvest Heartland, and today I had a Greek yogurt for breakfast. How about you? And as you think back over the last few hours and what you've eaten, race might be the last thing on your mind, if that is, you're white like me. I wish there were no connection, but unfortunately access to a filling and nutritious breakfast and lunch and dinner differs by race. Black, Latinx, and Indigenous families in our community are at least twice as likely to live with hunger than white families. And let me say that again. In our community, the ease with which families can fill their cupboards and their families' bellies differs across racial groups, and this is unacceptable. I'm asking you to take in this troubling, long-standing truth amid multiple crises coming at us each day and to notice the connections. The spotlight drawn by George Floyd's killing shines a light on long-standing inequities, including access to food. Both hunger and racial inequities are getting in the way of our work to rebuild and are complicating efforts to fight COVID-19. Hunger is surging in my own South Minneapolis neighborhood and in other Twin Cities communities. Grocery stores were destroyed in the uprising that followed George Floyd's killing. Hundreds of thousands of jobs have been lost across the state due to COVID-19, with Indigenous, Black, and Latinx workers in Minnesota bearing the brunt of the unemployment burden. 1 in 2 Black Minnesotans applied for unemployment since March, compared to 1 in 4 white workers. And on top of it all, Minnesotans of color are dying from COVID at twice the rate of white Minnesotans. We're here today to look at the stark racial disparities and unpack who is hungry. We'll have a conversation about what needs to change to create a more just food system that better serves all of our neighbors. As a white leader, I must listen to the voices and experiences of people of color and learn about the roots of these untenable divides and the systems that reinforce them. I will stay at the table to help find and implement community-driven solutions. We have an impressive group assembled here this morning with us, and I'm so honored to help host them. I'm grateful for every minute you can give us right now. I know everyone is busy, but please welcome Tomme Beevas, founder and chief strategic officer at the famous Pimento Jamaican Kitchen, where Tomme's grandma's recipes are doing our town proud. Also with us are Michelle Horovitz, executive director for Appetite for Change, building health, wealth, and social change through food. And Dr. Jaime Slaughter-Acey, a trailblazing researcher on the intersection of race and health at the University of Minnesota. Last but not least, Commissioner Irene Fernando, who has led the way in declaring racism a public health crisis in Hennepin County, is also here. Thank you so much for joining us. For your incredible work. And Dr. Slaughter-Acey will start us off with some valuable context around racial inequities in our communities. And Doctor, thank you for being here. I will pass the virtual mic to you now.
Thank you for having me here today. And on this panel with such an amazing cast and crew who have a vested interest in addressing racial inequalities, especially as they relate to food insecurity and creating food security for all of us. When we think about racial inequalities and how they may contribute to hunger and health, we have to really think about what are sort of the determinants, the causes of health inequalities. And so we have to look at racial inequalities in the social determinants of health as a major player in the patterning and structuring of health in Minnesota, but in the United States overall. And when we talk about social determinants of health, we're talking about access to neighborhood resources, quality education, insurance, access to quality health care, and the right to have optimal health, right? To have a foundation for which optimal health can be established. And when we talk about the social determinants of health, we can recognize that there's inequalities in the social determinants of health that promote and support optimal health and well-being. And this stems from systems of oppression. And specifically, when we're talking about racial inequalities, we're talking about racism. That is a fundamental driver of inequalities in the social determinants of health. And so when thinking about racism, we need to think about it in, like, racism has many faces, and the face that we are most associated with in terms of what we are taught is interpersonal racism. And that is experiences of discrimination and assumptions that are exhibited in people's individual behaviors. But that type of racism is only really the tip of the iceberg with respect to patterning the social determinants. In terms of patterning the determinants, we really need to look at structural racism, which is really the system of public policies and institutional practices, and even cultural representation that allocates power and privilege based on race. And in our country, it allocates that privilege and power based on what's defined as whiteness, or who is white. And then I also want to just encourage people to also consider cultural racism, which is a part of structural racism. And the way that I like to think about cultural racism is that it's the glue that keeps the system connected. So if we have policies, institutions, and institutional practices that are connected like gears in a system, that distribute health promoting resources to one group over another, cultural racism is the oil that keeps that system running very smoothly. And so we need to sort of look at how cultural racism, which is the value of the dominant culture over other cultures in society, is infused within our institutions, our policies, and other sort of norms in our society and everyday action. So in terms of, when we think about racial inequalities in the US and Minnesota, we know that Minnesota overall has some of the best health outcomes. It's one of the healthiest states in the country. But when it comes to racial inequalities in health and other domains of of well-being, we rank at the very bottom. And this is in part due to the structural racism that is infused in our policies, our institutions, and even cultural representation of who's valued in our society. And it has direct impact on the resources that are available in neighborhoods that are comprised predominantly of people of color. And so I'm just gonna pause it there and hand it off to the next person.
Great. Thank you so much, Doctor, for all of that context and that information. I will pass the mic now to Commissioner Fernando. Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you for your work. And tell us how our elected officials here in the Twin Cities addressing systemic racism.
Well, hello, thank you for having me. I'm Commissioner Irene Fernando, but you can call me Commish. I was elected to the Hennepin County Board in 2018. I'm the youngest woman ever elected to this board, and alongside my friend and colleague, Angela Conley, we are the first commissioners of color ever in Hennepin's 168-year history. Counties touch every part of our lives and are often overlooked, and so I can't speak to all electeds, but counties are situated between state and city, and we touch everyone's lives because we are the implementers of federal and state laws. We don't have our own charter or our own constitution. We take the laws that the state or feds bring down, and then we implement them in our county roads, in our libraries, and our social services. And so it is an honor to serve in this role and to represent Hennepin County District 2. On June 30th, specifically because we are talking a lot about racism, specifically structural or systemic racism, Hennepin County declared racism a public health crisis. We are the first governing body in Minnesota .
Okay, Commissioner, it looks like we have lost your video. You've just frozen for a quick minute here. I'm so sorry to report. So we'll wait for the Commissioner to hopefully rejoin us when her connection kicks back in. And in the meantime, we'll move to our next panelist. Allison, if you want to move us to the intro.
I'm happy to, and just we'll get back to the Commish when she comes back.
Did this just cut off like in the middle of my...
Sorry, we did lose you. We're glad you're back.
Wow. You know, I mean, in person, I hear the orchestra music playing and they're like, get off the stage. I think technologically, I apologize. Hopefully I got cut off at the secondly part. So secondly, our response to the data should be in a public health, with a public health approach. Because reducing disparities and silos can only get us so far. We must take a public health approach and go beyond treating symptoms, which is what clinical approaches typically do, and step back and examine why are these harmful results persisting for our Black, Indigenous, and people of color residents, and how might we prevent these harmful results from continuing in the future. So what I'm expressing here is not new, nor is it accidental. Our systems are not broken. Our systems do not work for all of us because they were never designed for all of us. At the time that Hennepin County was formed and commissioners were created, at the time where my title was created, I was considered subhuman by the law. I was considered subhuman by our laws. It still took decades, centuries for women to even have rights, although that subhumanity wasn't as applied as readily along lines of race. When we look at our laws, when have we been allowed to speak? And that's when we should really consider who was in charge at that time. And how are we expanding who sees themselves in the story of leadership and politics and the types of decisions they are making to further expand a much more vibrant reality for our neighbors. And so it's really kind of incredible. I mean, as recently as the 60s and 70s, women couldn't have bank accounts. So I use gender expression as another way of helping to break down the divisive and intentional ways that race has been criminalized and exploited in our laws and in our policies. So this has always been true. This is painfully true today due to the pandemic and ensuing economic pressures, because just as resources are not distributed equitably, crisis is not distributed equitably either. And people who are dying earlier, getting sick more, are our Black, Indigenous, and people of color neighbors, not because they are making these choices, but because they are required to be underpaid by going to work. These are the individuals that are being required to exit the only cure we have, which is a home, if they have a home at all, to go into settings, often without the equipment and the support needed. So I'm grateful for the time. I apologize for cutting out. I am very appreciative of all the work that is represented here. You can reach me at my website, hennepind2.com, Hennepin spelled out, D, letter D, number 2.com, or Irene.Fernando at hennepin.us. And I look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner, or Commish, as you said. Really appreciate that. And Elizabeth, let's make sure to put that contact information in the chat so everyone can just click on it as well, and on Facebook. So thank you. So turning the page a little bit here to our next presenter. As a food bank, Second Harvest Heartland, and our team here is very interested in how food is grown, cooked, and shared to create more equal access. We have guests here today who live these efforts, and next we'll hear from one of them, Tomme Beevas from Pimento Jamaican Kitchen. Tomme, you have the mic.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for hosting this very important conversation. It is certainly an honor to be here, and the questions that were asked were very provocative, thought-provoking, at least for me. And so it talks about, when did I learn the power of food and who taught me the power of food? I learned the power of food at a very early age from my grandmother, Babaloo. I would watch my grandmother, Babaloo, which is no different than most Black women or African-American women or women of color who are cooking big pots that brings the community together, that brings the village together, that brings the family together, to where we're having that conversation, that difficult conversation or that celebratory conversation. And so similarly, we're using food at Pimento to bring our community together. We've traditionally been a safe space for people, and Pimento was built by its community. And so whether it was COVID or whether it's the uprisings, we wanted to be there for a community as well. And ways in which we've been able to use food is, one, after everything happened and our community had no supermarkets, we were able to partner with, we had employees and volunteers working together to activate the Twin Cities to figure out how to get products donated. And we turned our rum bar from a rum bar to a food bank, if you will, and so we had, in no time, we had to figure out how to create the systems, how to streamline the systems, how to build the structures and the hierarchy and, the distribution efforts. And it was quite a learning experience. Imagine a world where we'd have bottled this up to where there's a disaster and we know spot on how we need to activate the community, how we need to meet our community needs. And so those are some of the things that we're already thinking through. And so we used food as a way over the past few months to bring our community together, not just through the donation. So at Pimento, you'll see a long line from one side of people coming in with their trucks full of products that they're donating. And on the other end of the block, you have people who are coming up to receive donations for their families. And we fed over 8,000 people, 8,000 families during this time frame. And it's just interesting that that a rum bar was able to see themselves as an instrument of this liberation, to where we moved from jerk chicken and rum punch to diapers and milk. and it's because we see ourselves we're asking everyone to see themselves as an instrument of this liberation. When we talk about using jerk chicken, we've also provided jerk chicken to those who are protesting, those who are on the front lines, because again, even back in the days in the civil rights movement, you'll have the women in the church basements who are making food and taking that to the community as everybody was out there on the front lines. We've also been able to use food to bring our community together. So we brought together the mayor, for example, with the community leaders, with the city leaders, and we hosted our Pimento Summit in the Pimento backyard, where we were able to get them to sit across from each other and have conversation with the community in that safe space, because we've traditionally been that safe space where we call both the mayor and our community leaders our friends. And so we were able to use food to bring our friends together. And then most importantly, we've been able to use food to sort of provide dignity for our people. So for example, Juneteenth, we were able to bring together some of the top chefs, including Chef Andrew Zimmerman, including the Wadi brothers from World Street Kitchen, including the chef from Alma and Braza, out there at Juneteenth, cooking for people for free on West Broadway. The amount of dignity and pride that people were able to see that, yes, we all care. We're all in this together. In Minneapolis, we all see each other. And so when we talk about the race and intersectionality of food, we already know that zip code determines access to food. Zip code determines access to education. This zip code determines access to where we find a movie theater, for crying out loud. And so we know that it is all central to our geography and all that. But imagine a world where instead of in the suburban communities, we're going to local targets, buying the product and bringing it to, say, South Minneapolis at Pimento and donating it. And then Pimento, in effect, using the economic term dumping said product into that same community. Imagine a world where instead we were encouraging a community to go out and find their local African markets, their local Latino markets, their local Asian markets, and go spend the money there to therefore purchase more culturally appropriate foods and items to give back to that same community. But also imagine the economic implications of investing in those markets. Love Target, and yet, there are opportunities for us to rethink and reimagine how we're supporting our community. And so imagine, as we talk about rebuilding the Twin Cities, we know that everybody is already excited and ready to bring change, because if any place can do it, the Twin Cities can. We have the willpower, we have the brain power, we have the resources to build that model city. And as part of that model city, imagine if, for example, we would go, say, buy a whole shelf of kidney beans at the local Asian market or the local Caribbean market, and so imagine even if Target had like their mini kiosks for distribution in the communities where we have food deserts, to where instead of us buying the food and bringing it to Pimento, buy the food and go distribute it to those second harvest kiosks or those Target kiosks within these communities, to where they're so tangible and accessible and right there. And because of course we know transportation is a huge issue with getting whatever food wherever it's donated. So in terms of like what we imagine we used to talk about the 1,000 points of light. Imagine 1,000,000 points of light now, where we're saying we want to illuminate the city, illuminate the world, where we all see ourselves as instruments of liberation. Whether you're an artist, figure out how you're going to bring your art to market to be a part of this liberation. When we talk about liberation, we're talking about economic liberation, political liberation, and social liberation. The political liberation is how do we find right candidates like the Commish, and those like that who are serious about getting work done and putting the support behind them, put the resources behind them, to where they can effectively compete on a flat field. When we talk about the social liberation, we talk about the healing. We talk about what Dr. Jamie was just talking about, and how do we help each other rewrite and understand her history. 700 years before 1492, there was a wonderful period that none of us happen to know about, the Dark Ages. But how do we re-educate ourselves to where people aren't being surprised by a thing called Juneteenth? Like, oh wait, it exists. Then when we talk about the economic liberation, we're talking about how do we create 1 million black businesses to help address these issues. It's not just, we shouldn't just be proud to be like, oh, we have a black business, oh, we have a Pimento. We should be ringing the New York Stock Exchange bells every single day. This should be such a part of our mainstream operating. We cannot be a truly capitalist society unless we're all able to participate. And now is the time, now is the moment. We're all excited that we have the resources and we can certainly get it done, but we just have to reimagine these instruments of liberation. And with that, I turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Tommy. I can feel your passion and energy even over Zoom, and I just am so thankful that you're sharing it with us. in this community. So then we will turn it to Michelle Horovitz from Appetite for Change now, one of our strong and proud partners with Minnesota Central Kitchen. And I will, you have the mic, Michelle, now.
Thank you. Thanks, Allison, and thanks to all of the other speakers. I really couldn't have said it better than Tomme or Irene or Dr. Acey. That was incredible. Appetite for Change is a nonprofit social enterprise. We're based in North Minneapolis, serving the Twin Cities. And our mission is to use food as a tool to build health, wealth, and social change. It was founded by Princess Haley, Latasha Powell, and myself. And one of the reasons that the three of us came together around food is that food is that powerful tool that Tomme spoke about. It is the one thing that blurs cultural lines, religious lines, racial lines. We all eat. And the three of us came together to start Appetite for Change because of the systematic racism and the social determinants of health that we see in our communities, and the vast disparities that we see. And I think other folks touched on this, but I just want to reiterate for those watching or who may be asking, you know, or thinking that it's about personal choice, like, oh, why don't people just choose to eat healthier, or why don't people just learn how to cook homemade meals? Imagine if you don't have a car, you don't have access to transportation, and you live in a community where there is not a grocery store within walking distance, or when you are surrounded by every fast food dollar menu drive-through option that you can imagine, and yet there's not one sit-down restaurant. That's partially why we opened Breaking Bread Cafe in North Minneapolis on West Broadway, because people deserve the dignity of being able to sit down in a restaurant, and to be able to order fresh and local, made from scratch food that is made and served by people who look like them. And so I do want to reiterate that it is the policies and systems and environment that we live in that create the barriers to social determinants of health, to optimal health options, and for people even having the choice. So, you know, if you think about a thriving community that has restaurants, farmers markets, food trucks, grocery stores, co-ops, and as a result of the COVID-19 crisis and the vast increase in food insecurity, you know, I say we're living through a double pandemic, one that just hit us out of nowhere, and one that's been around for 400 years, and that's been silent and deadly. And the uprisings after the murder of George Floyd have closed grocery stores since the protests. The one big box grocery store on the north side, luckily we still have North Market, and Aldi is still open, and Solo, but Cub Foods closed. And as a result of that, Appetite for Change has really shifted. We are grateful to be a partner of Minnesota Central Kitchen. We're making now up to 10,000 meals a week, distributing them in the community through our partners. But we've also just piloted a really exciting meal box program. So we're partnering with Local Crate and the Good Acre and Eastside Table, and we are producing culturally relevant recipes, buying only locally grown produce and protein, and getting meal kits sent out to over 200 families across the Twin Cities, so people can make a meal at home and serve their family and connect around the dinner table. So my call to action is to speak out, speak up, vote for people who, like Commissioner Fernando, believe and fight for our community, recognizing that racism is a public health crisis. And if you want more information about Appetite for Change, you can go to our website, afcmn.org, or follow us on social media. And every Monday, my co-founder Princess is on Facebook Live at 1 p.m. talking about all the work that we're doing. So thank you to Second Harvest and to all of the partners on this call.
Thanks, Michelle. And we'll put that information in the chat so people have a direct link to your organization. And we are so proud to partner with you and your team at Appetite for Change. You are doing important work, and none of us can do this alone. And we appreciate you being alongside us in our efforts. And thank you all for being here to continue this conversation. Before we move to questions, I want to be clear about Second Harvest Heartland's unwavering commitment to ending hunger together in this community. Here in Minnesota, that means doing whatever it takes to tackle the alarming disparities in food access. The leaders we've hosted today have provided us with ideas, some roadmaps for taking action to fight for food justice in our community, and now it's on us to keep doing this work and to make it a reality and to continue having conversations like this. There is so much more to say. We talked about this before we got on the call, and half an hour seems very short with these big problems that we're to solve. But I'm sure we have a lot of questions, so we're going to go to that now. And Elizabeth, I know you will lead us through those questions that we have.
Sounds good. Thanks, Allison, and thanks so much, panelists. I want to acknowledge quickly that the Commish needs to hop off the call. Thank you so much, and we look forward to keeping the conversation going with you, Commissioner Fernandez. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you so much. We have a question and a comment from Betsy in St. Paul, who commented that offering dignity along with food help is a critical takeaway from this conversation. She is excited to hear this said. Please say it again and again. And then she used 4 exclamation points, so she really means it. Then she asked, how could we use food to bridge cultural divides in the time of COVID? This is something she spent a lot of time thinking about in her life overall. I can't make dinner for my neighbors right now. So how to connect with people via food right now when it seems more important than ever is what I think Betsy is really asking about. Michelle and Tommy, would you like to tackle this one for us?
The first one that comes to mind is, how about exchanging recipes? So exchange a jerk chicken recipe with the barbecue person next door. And through that interchange is how you can even have a conversation about the culture. So if you have an African neighbor or a Latino neighbor, go figure out to make something from their house and exchange a recipe is the first thing that comes to mind, because that's how we also get to know our neighbors.
Yeah, that's so great. I love that. Anything?
I love that idea. Oh yeah, I was gonna say, like, you know, if people are comfortable socially distancing and sitting outside while the weather is still nice, invite neighbors over to your yard and you know, have a recipe exchange and talk about your food, you know, memories and what recipes or what things ring true to you and your culture, and also, you know, connecting virtually is also another option, and just sharing a meal over Zoom. I know that's not super exciting, but in the time of COVID, it's you know, the best we can do.
Absolutely. And getting involved with your organizations has been helpful for me as I think about how to make a change during COVID. So one idea as well. Thanks, folks. Jordan from Prior Lake wants to ask Tommy, what's been toughest and most exciting to be a business leader of color in Minnesota?
Ooh, very good question. I would say the toughest part of being a business leader in Minnesota is the lack of access that one has. But I think that's even for women leaders or, you know, non-mainstream leaders tend to face those challenges. And also, I guess it's the lack of camaraderie in terms of like, oh wait, who do I have to bounce these ideas off at this level of leadership is kind of a challenge. But I will say that one of the best parts about Minnesota is that everybody's so supportive. Everybody's looking for an opportunity to support. And once you have a great product, great service, and you're making a great connection, Minnesotans are there to support. And so I encourage any business leader or any person of color, or any woman or anyone to go ahead and dip your pinky toe in the entrepreneurial space. It's really fun.
Thank you, Tommy. That's fantastic. Penny from Afton, says, thanks for the conversation. She's really pleased to listen in. She says that she has a lifetime of mistaken ideas about race and basic needs, and that she's learned a lot this summer. She'd like to hear from the panel about how she can keep learning about race to make sure her kids don't need another George Floyd to know what they need to know. Dr. Jamie, I wonder if you'd be willing to begin addressing this one?
Sure. I think that's a really great question. And I mean, I think it's a question that's relevant to all of us, regardless of our race, ethnicity. I think the process of learning about race and racism and how it impacts us in a number of different ways is sort of a life-learning process, so that we can begin to approach our life and our daily interactions, right, with different environments from an anti-racist approach. And so I think, you know, there's been a lot of reading lists that have been put out by people that is encouraging us to delve deeper into what does racism mean? How does it operate? Those multiple faces of racism, what it can look like, and what does anti-racist language, behavior, attitudes, policies look like. Beyond the reading aspect, I think learning about race and the meaning of race happens through intentional conversations with those around you, sit down discussions with your children, your partner, your friends. If you see something, make it into a teaching moment, right? And I think also incorporating diversity in terms of books, games, movies, so that cultural entertainment, right? So that cultural representation is there, and it's not just representing the dominant culture in our society. And I think teaching moments is probably one of the biggest things. And it takes me back to actually a couple of weeks ago, in which my 6-year-old was, I guess, very sensitive to her social context, the environment that's going on. And we, you know, everybody is quite busy, you know, so if you're running to the grocery store, picking up your child from whatever, worrying about, you know, your job, that sort of thing, you sometimes don't have opportunity to pause and reflect and be empathetic to your environment around you. And so my daughter and I, we had gone to Cubs to do some you know, essential grocery shopping. And when we came out, there was a man who was asking people for some assistance in terms of getting something to eat. And one of the things that I noticed about this older man who was African American is that he was only going up to other African Americans, and I think that's because he felt that was a safer place, and would more likely be on the receiving end, right? With respect to his request. And so, because my daughter, well, not because, but I wound up taking this moment because my daughter was asking, why is he asking for money? To actually sort of explain context, environment, right? Why doesn't he have food, she asked. Well, you have to explain that the world is structured such that everyone does not have access to food. And that's where the teaching moment comes in, right? Our children are really great at asking these difficult questions, but we have to pause and stop in order to address them effectively. And then the other part of it too is actually demonstrating how to address that. So in that particular situation, you know, incorporating dignity in there, we didn't just go give him money or anything like that. We went up and asked him, would you like us to help, and what do you need that would make things better, you know? And so through that conversation, I was able to identify some things some needs that I could address within my means. And so I use that example as a way to say that we have to actually take the time out and look at our surroundings, interact with our surroundings. And it's not just on those one-on-one interactions, but it's also in terms of our economic and food security policies to make sure that they incorporate dignity, that they are reflective of us all and not just the majority.
Thank you so much, Dr. Slaughter-Acey. And that feeds perfectly into the next question. Anthony from St. Paul would like to hear from all three of the panelists on what single policy change, if you could make any, would you make to move us away from structural and cultural racism? So you've got a magic wand and you can change any single policy, folks.
I'll go. I actually gave this one some thought, or I didn't know this question was coming, but I had some thought. I think one of the things, what I would change is develop policies that promote rejuvenation of neighborhoods, that promote food security and economic security, because those are so tied together, and do not promote gentrification. Because one of the things that we notice, and there's always that saying that once a Trader Joe's moves into a neighborhood, the neighborhood immediately starts to undergo gentrification, and the community, persons of color and others who are marginalized tend to be pushed out of those neighborhoods. So that would be the biggest.
Thank you. Tommy and Michelle, you both, I see you leaning into your cameras. You've got some.
I'll let Michelle go ahead.
Yeah.
If I had to just pick one, I would say reparations.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, in addition to jumping on the reparations one, love that one. I think what we need to do is remove all policies that prevent, whether it's Black people or people in general, from meeting their full economic potential. And so when you think of when Black people start doing it, it becomes illegal. You know what I'm saying? And when white people start doing it, it becomes legal. So how do we recognize that Black people are also an entrepreneurial force? We've been able to sustain our economies, whether above board or below board. And so how do we bring all of the, for lack of a better term, Black market into the mainstream, and basically remove policies that prevent us from creating whatever cottage industries we are using to sustain our economies for centuries?
Thank you all. And thanks for the great question, Anthony. Tommy, one for you. This is a bit of a switch in gears. Joanna wants to know, what is in your jerk rub? But this is sounds like a recipe question. She's stuck at home, misses it, and must have it, she said. So I assume that's a bit proprietary, but anything for Joanna?
Hey, Joanna. Yes. First of all, you start with pimento. And we're not just talking about the restaurant itself, but we're talking about the ingredient. So you definitely want to go and get the allspice berry. that is what is actually pimento, and that is the key ingredient in most Jamaican foods, 90% of Jamaican foods. But you also want to ensure that you're having not being afraid of the spices and the seasonings and the flavors with Jamaican food, and with food from the African diaspora. You go bold. So if it's you're using a bit, one thing you have to measure is, of course, your salt and your pepper and your oils and butters, those type of things. But beyond that, feel free to go bold with jerk recipes. You definitely want to start with pimento. You want to have the Scotch bonnet or habanero pepper. You want to have scallion and thyme, and you want to have ginger and garlic and those types of things. But you also want to have your food marinating for at least 24 hours. So it's about slow, taking your time and cooking with a lot of love and a lot of heart. Don't be afraid. Have fun with it is what I'd say.
That's fantastic. Thank you all. Well, we are a little bit over time, and those are the end of our questions, although I know we're just scratching the surface. I think we're all feeling the power of food and conversation, and you bring those two together, and it's a pretty great morning. So thank you all for your partnership and your wisdom and thoughts. We're really grateful, and have a wonderful day.